Now, the next player we're going to talk about is Ainias Smith from Texas A&M. He was picked in the 5th round of the draft, and we had already done a video on Ainias Smith, so I'll link that video in the description. Overall, I gave this pick a B because very much for the similar reason I gave Shipley a B. I think he's going to be a role player that can fill his specific role very well. He's a tough and competitive and creative slot player, especially with the ball in his hands. But I think he's more than just a gadget guy. I know a lot of people, when I look on Twitter, say that this is a gadget guy. I think he can develop into more of a consistent, underneath intermediate player for you that you can go to and trust that you can go to when coverage takes away your first and second options. He's not a guy that I'm going through and I'm designing a whole bunch of plays for every week, but he's a guy that if you need him to go catch a sit route over the ball and then turn up the field and get an extra 5, 6, 7 yards, he's a guy that can go do that. He also has very reliable hands. He had one of the best catch scores in this past draft class and one of the best catch scores over the past 5 draft classes. So he's a reliable player, a competitive player, and one that can create for himself after the catch. And really, he's a player that I think is good for the team because he's not a player that necessarily demands a lot of attention or is going to demand a lot of targets. And you need someone that is going to fit into their role for this team because this team goes AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, and then probably Saquon Barkley, and then everyone else can get in where they fit in. And Smith is a guy that I think you can trust to catch the ball and then get as much as you can after the catch, and is just going to be an overall reliable player for the Eagles over the long run.
Yeah. And if the Eagles receive first week 1 down in Brazil, I think this is the guy who's going to be catching the ball. I think he projects extremely well in this new style of kickoff returns because he's got a little bit sturdier frame than some of the old kick returners. He's got vision and he's not easy to arm tackle. And those are the style of tackles that happen a lot in this new kickoff format. And I think he projects extremely well in that role. I gave it a B overall. In terms of him as a receiver, I think his routes are rounded. He put on considerable weight since he was like in high school. Now I know everyone puts on weight, but it was noticeable. Whereas when he was running routes, like in camps in high school, there was a lot more like quickness and burst like in and out of his cuts and change of direction. Whereas now it looks like he's carrying about 20 pounds or potentially even more, and they're a little bit more rounded off. In the yards after catch situations, I think he's awesome. He's really hard to tackle. He's just a whirling dervish where he'll just spin and bounce off people, fall forward, and before you know it, he picked up an extra 10, 12 yards. So I expect him to be good in that role. And like as you mentioned, a lot of the underneath stuff. Now, the reason it's not higher than a B is he did have some pretty concerning medicals. Up until 2022, he was completely injury free. Then he had some like freak injury, which involved the separated ankle. And then he came back, and before the combine, I believe he discovered a shin fracture, which they were calling shin splints. And so I looked into this guy's background. He was incredible at track in high school. And he said, I would have ran in the 4.3s if I wasn't injured. Now, I don't know how much he's puffing himself up, but I do think there's potentially meat on the bone in terms of his speed. If he can recover fully from some of those injuries, I think he's a little bit faster than he tested. So that's encouraging to me. But also those 2 injuries I listed are things that I was like, okay, if that comes back, I mean, this guy might have to like retire. So that's why I gave it a B.
Yeah, so to your point, he does look a little skinnier if you look at his tape from his earlier years in college, and he looks faster then too. And he had a pretty significant injury, like you said, in his 2022 season, and he came back a little bit slower after that. Now, does that improve with another offseason under his belt of training and recovering from that? I'd hope so, but you never know. But if he can regain some of that form, now our last video we did on Ainias Smith, I talked about how I thought he wasn't going to be much of a deep threat, and I still don't think he will. But when I went back and looked at some of his earlier tape in college, he was making some plays down the field that gave me, and he looked a little faster, but that gave me some pause to think that, maybe he can be used and further down the field than what I initially thought just by looking off of his senior year tape. But again, that would take kind of getting back up to his playing speed that he was playing with earlier in his college career. We'll see if he can get there, or it might have been a thing where he put on some weight and wasn't quite as fast. But again, like you said, he's not the sharpest in and out of his breaks, but I don't think he's the guy that you're relying on to go win against man coverage. If you get man coverage, you're going to get AJ Brown and Devontae Smith with 10 targets, and everyone else is going to be at 2 because they're going to know that, like the Cowboys game last year where they got all the targets. Well, if you know who's one-on-one, you're going to go to your best one-on-one players. He's going to be good for the rise in zone defenses that we're seeing, where they're giving you space to work. You just have to find that space, and once you can get there and catch the ball and make stuff happen after the catch, I think that's where he fills in. He's going to be, I think he'll be a guy where you'll see much bigger splits on him and man coverage versus zone coverage. I don't think he's getting a ton of targets either way, but I think his yards per route run against man versus zone is probably going to be significantly different. It'll probably be a lot higher in zone coverage, is
Yeah,
my guess.
you make a great point about his effectiveness versus zone. As opposed, it's something, if you juxtapose with Quez Watkins, it's extremely noticeable. Where when I watch Smith, he would make himself extremely available to the quarterback. Like turn around, like frame his body directly in line with the quarterback, like here I am. And like he has really good peripheral awareness, so he knows that there's not someone right there where he's like inviting an interception or a big hit, which I love. Whereas Quez is like, don't throw to me. So
Yeah.
I in that sense I do really like him.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing with that too, when he is working in zone, he's a tough guy. He will catch the ball knowing he's going to take a hit. There's plenty of those reps on tape where he stays in, catches the ball, takes the hit, gets right back up. So he's a tough guy. Now the reason I gave it a B, I like Ainias. I'm high on him. The reason I didn't give the Eagles a higher grade on this pick is because, like I said, they could have gotten more dynamic players earlier in the draft. And I'm not even saying they had to pick someone in the second round. Could have been Burton, or even could have been Javon Baker. The big thing with those guys is if AJ or Devontae were to go down, those guys could fill in as your number 2 option. I don't think Ainias is the guy that fills in for you as your number 2 option if one of those guys goes down. So you have that added benefit to some of those earlier guys on the draft that you don't get with Ainias. And I think missing out on that is kind of a blow to your depth a little bit. So just for the reasons that they did make, especially with the Jalix Hunt pick, kind of really set themselves up where they kind of had to go with the receiver later as opposed to nabbing one of those guys that had just more talent and more big playability earlier in the draft. Now, let's get to the next pick, and it is a legacy pick, and Jeremiah Trotter Jr. from Clemson. I'm interested to see what you gave for this pick.
Yeah. So when they initially picked him and I saw the video after, Howie was like, get Jeremiah Trotter on the phone and with this shit-eating grin. And so I was like, man, he just wanted to make that call so badly. And it's like, it's a 5th rounder. So if they miss, it's almost like, who cares? Now, Candidly, I did not study him extensively pre-draft. I was focusing on some of the second round linebackers potentially. Um, but I gave it a B minus. I think he's very hard to project. Maybe you have a better feel for it. One thing I think is pretty much universally agreed on is he's a high IQ player. And the Eagles specifically came out and said they were looking for high IQ players that show toughness and have a competitive streak, chip on their shoulder. And I think he's exemplary of that. And that's why he was marked as a Red Star player. Even though his testing was really bad and his measurables look suspect, I thought those didn't show up on film to that extent. Like, yeah, he did at times look slow on film and he did look small at times, but it's not like he was getting engulfed all the time by blocks where he's actually, because he plays with one of the lowest pad levels I've ever seen a linebacker, and his lateral agility is good and he uses his hands, he's actually pretty effective at block shedding from what I saw. When he actually gets his hands on the ball carrier, it seems like he wraps him up and brings him down most of the time. And he's good at figuring out what the offense is trying to do on pass plays. Now, like, maybe his body can't teleport him into the play, but sometimes if you read it quickly enough, you can make up for that lack of speed. So I think there's potential there. I think he will at the very least be a special teams player, a rotational linebacker who, if he can develop his athleticism and add a little bit more bulk to his frame. Now, those may be big ifs. He could develop into a starting linebacker. I don't think that's impossible.
Yeah, and I think he's very similar in a lot of ways to Nakobe Dean in terms of their size, their athleticism, just kind of the way they move on the field. I think they're very similar players, and to be honest, that's probably Trotter got drafted around probably where Nakobe Dean probably should have gotten drafted last year. Uh, a lot of people think that Nakobe Dean slid because of an injury issue. I don't really buy it. If you look at David Ojabo that same draft year, tore his Achilles in the pre-draft process. He was supposed to be a he's supposed to be a late first, early second round pick, and he got picked in the mid second round. And that's a torn Achilles. That's a major injury, not some shoulder injury that a player might have had. I think Nakobe slid because the NFL didn't view him as highly as draft Twitter did, honestly. And the Eagles came and scooped him up. I think that Trotter going where he went, I think is I gave the pick a B because that's about the type of player that you expect at this point in the draft. You're either getting a traits guy or you're getting someone that's a good football player. I think Jeremiah is a good football player in terms of he's got good football IQ. He's got a nose for the ball. He's tough. But like with Nakobe, it's that athletic limitations that I think kind of puts a ceiling to the player that they can become. Now, they're both very similar in size to TJ Edwards, so I think TJ Edwards is a ceiling, and I would love to have TJ back on this team. But that's kind of the ceiling that you're looking at for those type of players. And the fact of the matter is, players with their profiles don't succeed all that often. Small and slow is a hard combination to overcome in the NFL. But again, he was picked in the 5th round. That's kind of what you're expecting in the 5th round. You're hoping that their football IQ can overcome some of those limitations. And I think that's the reason why Trotter will probably be in the league for a while. Now, he may be a backup player in the league, but he'll end up getting playing time. He'll play somewhere. I just don't know if he's ever going to become a full-time, long-term starter anywhere, or if he's going to become, a high-end player. I think he's more likely going to be a depth linebacker. That's probably what he's going to become. But it's always fun for the storyline and the family legacy of him coming back to Philly. So I think it's a little added juice to me for the grade. But again, when you're picking in the 5th round, I think Trotter is about the player that you hope to get at that point in time.
So wait, what was your grade?
I gave them a B for the pick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're pretty close. I can already anticipate it now. He's going to make like two really good special teams plays, and they're going to be like, get this guy on the field, especially with the guy, like the linebackers that look, God willing, I hope they play amazing. But well, I'm sure we'll get into that more in the off season as the off season continues about like the questions about the linebacker play. But it's almost comical that they're gonna have three Oompa Loompas potentially out there with like, and I don't know if the facts align with what I'm saying here, but like super low to the ground, like short arms, like not that rangy. That's just gonna look funny.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm already getting tired of, and I haven't even heard it yet, but the Nakobe Dean versus Jeremiah Trotter Twitter debates that are going to happen all summer, all preseason. It's just I can already tell that's going to be a tiring conversation that we're going to be having at some point.
So I have a hot take. Now I think we're an anti hot take podcast, but I think there's a non-zero chance that the best linebacker on the team is Oren Burks.
Yeah.
So we could get into that a little bit later.
I'll take any linebacker that's been through that whole Sala, D'Amico Ryans tree, or anyone from the 49ers. I'll take that. I mean, Nicholas Morrow ended up getting the most snaps at linebacker last season, and he was the guy nobody was talking about. And this draft, this linebacker room is setting up exactly the same way, where the guy that we don't think is going to be the starter is going to end up being the starter. So I wouldn't be surprised. Now, I want to jump to, this wasn't the next guy picked, but I wanted to jump to this guy real quick because I think we can kind of group the next two guys after that together. But I want to touch on Johnny Wilson, receiver from Florida State. This 6 foot, what is he, 6'6" or 6'7" monster playing receiver. What did you think about their selection of Johnny Wilson?
Yeah, this is another one where you'd be lying if you said you had a good feel about what his outcome is going to be. The track record for receivers that tall is horrible, first off. Now, the funny thing is, despite him being 6'7", 237 or whatever he is, I actually don't think he plays like that at all. So before he catches it, let's just talk about before he catches it. He's a finesse player. Like he tries to run, like fancy routes. He's got way better speed than you'd expect for someone of his size. But he's pretty soft. Like he can get jammed easily, even pushed off his route path at times. Now, once he catches it, he actually shows a lot of power. So it's a little bit enigmatic in that you only see the physicality, in my opinion, after the catch. So you'd hope he could bring that element of his game to his route running. There are flashes where he's catching the ball way above away from his frame, high pointing it. But it's not the usual. One of the things I like about him is when he's near the sidelines, he can go straight up for the ball without his feet leaving the ground. So he can get the 2 feet in all the time because he doesn't really have to jump and still gets way up there. Now, here's where I like him best. I like him as a guy who can find a soft spot in his zone and be a big target. And on in-breaking routes, like if a cornerback has outside leverage and he's running like a little skinny post or something like this, they just simply can't get around him. His body's way too big. So kind of on those like 8 to 12 yard passes that's like a slight in-breaker, I think he could be real good. If you go back and watch his 2022 film where he was the featured receiver, there was some nice plays on that film. So like he can't really uncover, despite him like being a little more polished route runner for someone of his size than you'd expect. It's like it's not like he's gaining much separation at all. Uh, so it's he, and I don't think he has much special teams value. So the weird thing is, I'm not really sure what his upside is. If it's like he's going to catch a couple inbreakers, find soft spots against zone, and make a couple contested catches using his height. What does that equate to? I'm not sure. Um, and then his floor is probably an XFL player.
Yeah. The when I initially saw him picked, my first reaction was whatever, because there had been people clamoring for Johnny Wilson to get drafted earlier. So in my mind, if we had taken him in the 4th or 5th round, I mean, really, if they had taken him somewhere in the 4th, I would have been like, what are we doing here? But to get him later in the draft, you need to take swings at some of those high upside guys, right? They took a swing on Ainias Smith, who I think is a high floor, low ceiling player, whereas Johnny Wilson is the exact opposite. He is very low floor, high ceiling player. And I like that the Eagles, if they're going to go with their late picks, that you look for some abnormal players out there. So I'm glad that if they went with a late round receiver like this, that they went with someone that isn't like a 5'9" guy that can't create after the catch. They're taking a swing on someone that could become something that's freaky, with a guy that size. But when I look at his profile, it's not one that has a lot of success. I generally don't enjoy targeting players that have these types of profiles where they don't create much separation. They have a good amount of drops. They don't create a lot of yards after the catch. That's kind of like a triple threat for me of maybe this isn't my guy. If you can't get open and struggle to catch the ball, that's all. I mean, that's like your job. Your main job is playing receiver. And if you look at the players ranked where my model looks at them, you're getting very, very few hits down there. Like your best player is gonna be like Drake London, who obviously is a good player, but he's also a high contested catch guy. He's not creating a ton of yards after the catch in the NFL. But that's like one of the very few players in that mold that have had success. You're really like,
but
if
the
you were
thing
to
is,
go ahead.
real quick, the thing is Drake London is extremely physical player who will body the DBs and consistently high point the ball. And I viewed Wilson as a more of a finesse player. There's more negatively connotated words you could use to describe that play style. Now, if with the yards after catch, you see it's in him. He has the potential to develop that physicality, but it didn't show up yet.
Yeah. And is it going to show up in the NFL? Usually you don't get a whole lot better at what you do in the NFL. Usually when I go through and look at these profiles and then look at how they're playing in the NFL, a lot of times it's the same correlation. If you're a high A-dot guy who catches okay but creates a lot of explosive plays, a lot of times that's the player you are in the NFL as well. If you're a high contested catch guy or a high contested target guy in college, it probably gets even worse in the NFL. It doesn't get easier to get open in the NFL. So for me, I usually try and stay away from those guys with those profiles just because the hit rates are just extremely low on them. At the end of the draft, you're drafting in the 6th round, you're looking for outliers. He could be an outlier, and I think he's worth taking a shot on just due to some of the ability that he has. For that reason, I've just spent this entire time shitting on him, but I gave them a B for this pick because, again, or I gave them a B plus actually, just because when you're picking in the 6th round, find someone that's got some freaky traits to them and see what can happen, and throw some darts out there, because you throw 3 or 4 darts, you might end up with a Jordan Mailata, and that changes your entire outlook at that position going forward.
Yeah, and he has proven that he can be a good receiver, at least at the college level. In 2022, he had the highest yards per route run of any player receiver in the Power Five who was in this draft. I'm pretty sure. And for someone whose average depth of target was so far down the field, he had a really good yards after catch number. So there's a couple metrics that like pop that could intrigue you. And personally, I thought the quarterback play was really bad there. Uh, the between the backup, I forget the guy's name there, and Travis, I thought there was a lot of bad quarterback play.
Yeah, that is true. That's a factor for sure.
Yeah. So the drops are, I think we glossed over that a little bit. You mentioned it. That's a big problem. Whereas like if all he's going to be is like a reliable possession receiver who can like move the chains, find soft spots in the zone, he cannot drop the ball. So we got to get him on the jugs. Have AJ teach him how to be physical on the routes. Encourage him to high point the ball more often and improve his burst and release package a little bit. If all those things happen, who knows? Maybe you have something, and so that's why I gave it a B.
Oh, great. Now let's get to we're running a little long, so let's get to our last two guys. And I think these are two guys that we can kind of package together. And it was Trevor Keegan, a guard out of Michigan, and Dylan McMahon, a center from North Carolina State. Now, admittedly, I haven't watched much film on either of these guys. I just don't have that much time to get to 250 whatever guys to watch film on. But I will get to them in the coming weeks, and we'll touch back on these guys and throw in some clips and some highlights of these guys as players and discuss a little bit more about who they are. But number one, they're athletic outliers. So much like the Johnny Wilson pick, I think when you're picking guys at the end of the draft, you want to take some swings on these guys that have very unique and good athletic skills that you can kind of mold into, see if you can mold and get something out of. I think everyone's gonna kind of make the comparison between McMahon and Kelsey because of their athletic testing numbers and because they were both 6th round selections at center and they're both undersized, which I think that's fair. I mean, if they found an outlier and Jason Kelsey in the 6th round who had very good testing numbers, why not go back and see if you can strike gold again with a player like McMahon? Now, he's not going to be who you're relying and pushing all your chips into the table for, but to throw a couple chips out on the table for a high upside swing, I'm all for it.
Yeah, totally agreed. I pretty much recuse myself from evaluating O-line, but a guy who has the national champ with Keegan, with the guy who has that national championship pedigree, who's known as a mauler and a reliable guard, I think that's awesome. And then McMahon has some interesting traits with his quickness at center. So yeah, like you said, with a 6th round pick, that's probably all you can ask for. So those are definitely like B plus range for me.
Yeah, and one thing about McMahon was his 3-cone time. I don't know if you've seen this. I'll throw it up on the screen when I edit the video, but there's a certain 3-cone time number that Josh Norris has talked about. And it's really interesting, the hit rates on players that if you're an offensive lineman and hit below a certain 3-cone time, it's like an 80% hit rate that you're going to start multiple seasons worth of games in the NFL. So it's almost one of those things where you see offensive lineman hit that time in the 3-cone, you might as well just blindly take a bet on that player. And so McMahon fits that bill. We'll see what he can become, but I think I thought it was a fun way to end the draft is getting some of these really high athletic, high upside guys that we can all root for in the years to come.